everyone. I'm Derek Chollet at the German Marshall Fund, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to today's book conversation with my friend Ganesh Sitaraman, whose new book, The Great Democracy: How to Fix Our Politics, Unrig the Economy, and Unite America, is a wonderful read about what's happening in the United States today and what we need to do to try to fix it. It covers the structure of our domestic economy, how to fix our politics, but also America's role in the world. Ganesh is a professor of law and the director of the program in law and government at Vanderbilt University Law School. He's also a longtime advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren. And Ganesh and I were talking probably close to a year ago about lining up a book talk to talk about the Great Democracy. But a few things intruded. First, we had the Democratic presidential primary early last year. Then we have, of course, had the pandemic. And so I'm really thrilled that we're able to come together to talk about this terrific book. And I'm especially thankful for Rana Foroohar for joining us today to offer her thoughts and insights on the subjects that Ganesh covers in his book. Rana herself is an acclaimed author. She's the FT Global Business columnist and associate editor. She's a CNN global economic analyst. And her book, which came out last year, and Rana, I apologize, I don't have a copy to hold up for everybody.
It's all right, it's all right.
But her book is entitled Don't Be Evil: How Big Tech Betrayed Its Founding Principles and All of Us. Many themes and subjects that are also covered in Ganesh's book. And she's also just finishing a book proposal that's about to go out that also picks up on many of the themes. So I'm really thankful, Rana, for you being here to offer your insights as well. So we're going to talk amongst the three of us for a while, but I very much welcome comments and questions from our audience. Please use the Q&A function to offer your questions and comments throughout the conversation. So Ganesh, welcome. Thanks for being here. I'd like to start things off by just asking you a very open-ended question, which will allow you to frame the book a little bit. And that's, what is the Great Democracy, and how do we build it?
Great. Well, thanks, Derek, so much. And thanks to everyone for being here with us, and to the German Marshall Fund in the United States for putting this together. As Derek mentioned, we've been trying to do this for a while, and I'm really excited to get a chance to talk with all of you. And I'm really excited to get a chance to chat with Rana and get her thoughts both on the book and more generally about a whole bunch of different topics. To your question, Derek, you know, the Great Democracy, the title is actually from a quote by Teddy Roosevelt, who said that a great democracy has got to be progressive, or else it will cease to be either great or a democracy. And he meant progressive in a specific way about about 100 years ago, when people talked about the progressives, not just as a kind of liberals and conservatives kind of way, but partly about progress, partly about moving forward, about grappling with and mastering the forces of society that are around you. And what I think, and when I talk about the Great Democracy, what I mean is that we need to have a democracy that actually captures what the fullest sense of democracy means. And that really includes three things. First is a political democracy, a government that's actually responsive to the people. Second is an economic democracy, an economy where there isn't too much economic power held or concentrated in a small number of hands. And then what I call a united democracy, or a sense of social solidarity, that people really see each other as part of the same project. And I think all three of these things are related. And really, when we think about the crisis of our democracy, and there's been a lot of books on the crisis of democracy recently, I think part of the challenge is that we really are suffering in American democracy on all three of these fronts. Almost every study in political science over the last 15 years shows that we don't have a responsive politics. We have a system that works really well for corporate interests and the extremely wealthy, but is not responsive to ordinary people. When we look at economic literature, we have widening inequality. We have massive imbalances in economic power, and we could talk about that in the conversation on monopolies across a whole bunch of different sectors, but including tech. And then when we think about our society, we're really fracturing in a lot of different ways. And we have problems with racial justice, we have geographic segregation, we have economic segregation, and we have these big cultural divides. And all of that together means that it's harder for people to see each other as, you know, together sharing a singular fate and trying to be able to determine that fate, which is really what democracy is about. So I think the crisis of democracy is really, in part, a crisis of our not understanding what it is to have a democracy, that it's a lot more than just political norms or institutions. It's truly a responsive government, an equal economy, and a solidaristic society. And that we have to work at all of those things in order to defend democracy, but more importantly, in order to achieve democracy. And I think this last part's really important. In America, we haven't really achieved democracy in our history, in part because we've been so fractured socially. Slavery, racism from the beginning, gender, conquest of Native Americans. I mean, across the board, we have had these big fractures that have meant that not everyone has been an equal participant in our democracy. And that's then been overlaid with an unequal economy that has also shifted power significantly to a small group of people rather than distributing it across everyone. And so what I think is to really achieve what a great democracy is, we need to actually be more progressive in both senses of the word. We need to move forward from where we are now. But the path to do that is going to be a wide variety of what I think in America people today call progressive policy ideas about addressing inequality in all its different forms.
Well, thanks for that intro. There's a lot of things in there I want to get into, but Rana, I'd like to turn to you first to give your thoughts just overall on the book. Obviously, the general frame with which Ganesh makes his argument, but also some of the specifics in terms of the remedies that he suggests.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I loved the book, and it's interesting. I read a lot of big ideas books, and not all of them are readable. This one is. This one actually makes you want to sit down and sort of devour it in one or two sittings, because it starts to make a lot of what we've been experiencing, things in our felt experience over the last 40 years or so, it makes them make sense. And one of the things that I really like is that Ganesh is connecting the problems in our democracy to what is happening in the political economy, and in particular identifying the ideas of neoliberalism as things that need to change and evolve. And neoliberalism, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, has different meanings, sometimes on different sides of the Atlantic, but in this context, we're really talking about a sort of an economic idea born in the 30s, Montpellier, kind of continued to deepen at the University of Chicago with Milton Friedman. But this idea that it's all about the individual, it's all about the individual choices, that if we all act rationally, in our silo, that society is going to end up okay. Well, there's lots of economic research done, primarily by people like Joe Stiglitz and others, that show that that's actually factually not true. But one of the big assumptions, and I don't think that we've talked and really landed on this enough, one of the big assumptions of neoliberalism is the idea that, everything should be free in the economy. Capital, goods, and people should all be free to move wherever they like, and that in doing so, the most productive allocation of resources will happen. Well, that all sounds great in theory. But in practice, what happens is that capital can move much more easily and fluidly than either goods or people. And that divide is particularly wide when it comes to capital and labor. So I would argue that the neoliberal ideas that have really been put into practice in conventional globalization since the 1980s are the key reason that we have ended up with this bizarro economy, very bifurcated, where the asset markets can be way up here, and yet second quarter GDP figures in the US can be the worst since the Great Depression. How is that possible? Because capital is up here. Companies are up here. They are flying 35,000 feet above the problems of the nation state, which is where voting is still happening. And I think it's important to note that nobody's trying to be venal here. I don't think that there's some cabal of terrible CEOs and financiers that are trying to do bad things to the world. We just have a system where incentives are set up in such a way that you are going to get that divide unless you start doing things differently. So I'll stop there, but I think this is a really important conversation to have right now.
Well, and Ganesh, I'd be interested to get your thoughts on neoliberalism. You talk a lot about it in the book, as you said, but also kind of your sense of what are the original sins of neoliberalism, and sort of trying to chart the journey of how we got to this point and this incredibly bifurcated economy that Rana just discussed?
I think Rana described the basic definition at a theoretical level really well, the kind of focus on the individual. In a policy conversation, I'd say that neoliberalism is really four different things: deregulation, privatization, liberalization, and austerity. And those four things have been a major part of the conversation since roughly 1980. In some places, it was a little earlier in the 70s, and some it was a little later. But they've been a big part of the conversation since then, and really defined the era of the last 40 years. And that's a big part of my argument in the book, is that we've lived through these different eras in our history. We lived through a liberal era from about the 40s through the 70s, and pretty much everyone was a small L liberal at that time. So in the United States, even conservatives, I mean, even your Eisenhowers, you've got Nixon saying he's a Keynesian. It's a very different world than the 80s through the present, where, you know, it's Bill Clinton who says the era of big government is over. Again, bipartisan, across the board, a kind of general sense that government should be out of the way and we should leave things to the marketplace. And I think that this shift has had really pernicious effects in a wide variety of ways. It's not just in our economy, but it's also in our politics and our society. And part of the reason is because the concentration of economic wealth and power that neoliberalism led to, partly for the reasons that Rana said, partly even domestically, because deregulation, privatization, austerity, and liberalization concentrate wealth and power, that together means that certain sets of people also have more political power. And you know, Rana said it's not a cabal, and I think it's right. It's not a conspiracy in some back room that's secret. What it is that we have laws that structure the economy, and this is true in any context. There's no escaping it. There's no magic. There's no natural state where there isn't some set of rules. And what's happened is the laws have been pushed increasingly to favor some over others. And that's a choice. It's a choice that we could make to rearrange the laws to create different kinds of incentives. But over time, people who have wealth and power have used the laws to serve their own ends. And it's meant that there have been distributional consequences to that, both in power and in economics. And so I think when a lot of people today talk about structural change, what they're getting at is, what are the laws that actually built this system? You know, and Rana used the word system, but I think that's what it is. It's the system works in a certain way. So it's not just that we can or should try to mitigate one particular small little problem here or there. It's that the structure of the system is designed to create a bunch of incentives that lead to these problems. And we could actually create a different design, but it's going to take structural change rather than little tweaks around the edges.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Rana, do you want to comment on that?
I totally agree. A couple of points. I mean, absolutely, yes, there needs to be structural change. We've been trying to tweak around the edges, I would say, for the last 20 years or so. But at core, and this is something I've always found quite fascinating. I mean, I'm a card-carrying Democrat, but I think there have not been as much differences that I would have liked to have seen between kind of middle-of-the-road Democratic economic policy and more conservative economic policy. They've both kind of followed these general neoliberal ideas over the last 20 years or so. You know, one of the big discussion points of the moment, and this has been so much in the national conversation since Trump came in, is this war with China, trade war with China. And, you know, we have this one world, two systems problem now for some time. There was a kind of an assumption that China was going to come along to the more Anglo-American style of capitalism, free markets, neoliberalism. That's not happening. I think that we need to refocus, and I think that that's what Ganesh is saying, rather than looking externally and blaming China, which is, you know, has its own goals, its own system, is going to do things its own way and make its own mistakes too. You know, in the US, I remember this when I was a kid, and my father was an engineer in the Midwest, and Japan was going to take over. Oh my God, it's Japan. Now it's like, oh my God, it's China. You know, they're going to do some things well, they're going to do some things badly. What we need to do is focus on, why is the ecosystem at home so broken? Why can we all feel that? I mean, particularly amidst COVID, we can all feel that. It's like a scrim that's been pulled back showing us just how broken everything is, from healthcare to the divide between asset wealth and income to infrastructure. I mean, there are like glaring things that we can do right now, but it does require this whole mind shift of moving from kind of individualism to community. And by the way, this does not equate socialism. It always makes me laugh as somebody, I spent 10 years in Europe. I think Americans don't actually know what a socialist is. You know, it's like Bernie Sanders is basically your middle of the road Christian Democrat in Germany, you know? Right. So let's just put that in perspective. I mean, I think a lot about the way European countries, in Germany, for example, it's a nice apples for apples comparison to the US, because rich country, liberal democracy has managed to keep wages higher, in part by thinking about communities. Now, they don't do everything perfectly either. I wouldn't want their banking system, but I think that their structure of having more labor involvement, having public-private partnerships, having a sense of, look, we're in this together, is exactly where we need to go. And Ganesh, I know you kind of get into some solutions along these lines in your book.
Well, that's a great thought, Rana, that I wanted to get to, which is kind of countries that Ganesh, in your view, are closest to what a great democracy should look like. And actually, one of our viewers has sent in a question along those lines. And so I'd like to hear from you on that, but also this question of China, which Rana has raised. Obviously, it's a huge debate in our campaign. We heard about it last night in the vice presidential debate. It's I think, one of the few foreign policy issues that's actually discussed in congressional campaigns right now. And what your book does very nicely is make this linkage between our domestic health and what we do out in the world. It's something that any president should understand, because they have to worry about the whole picture, not just foreign policy or domestic policy. But specifically thinking about China, you talk in the book how we need to have, I forget the exact words you use, but something like constructive working relationships with our great power rivals like China. So just define by what do you mean by that? How do you think about the China challenge? So first, what are the countries you think are good examples out there that we should perhaps have a little humility and learn from? But then also, how do you think about the China challenge?
So I think so let's start with the first part. You know, where can we do some learning in a comparative perspective? And one of the things that's just striking is, you know, how different kinds of structures are in different countries, even ones that are very similar to ours. You know, there's an old, I guess now it's quite old, scholarly work called, you know, the Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, which talks about the differences even just between, you know, the British, the French, the German, the Scandinavian, American. I mean, there are wide ranges of differences even within a set of countries that people often would say are liberal democracies. So there's a variety of liberal democracies, and each of them do things slightly differently. And I think there's different pieces we can take from. And when you're thinking about childcare, you know, the system in France is very different from the system in America, and there's things we can learn from that. I think in healthcare, there's lots of differences, and the American system has a lot of flaws. At the same time, you know, each country, and I think this is an important part about community and a real problem with the kind of neoliberal ideology, is that you can't have a perfectly transportable one-size-fits-all solution, precisely because we are all different communities with our own traditions, with our own histories. And whatever the policy we come up with has to be authentic and organic to our own, how we came to be where we are today, which is different from how someone else came to be where they are. So I think we can learn in terms of design, but you know, the way that that's adapted in our own context is always going to be different. And so, so that's why I don't think I would say there's one place where, if you're the United States, you know, we should just import certain sets of policies.
Sure.
I don't really think you can do that. I think it has to be built on our own system and deal with our own problems, which are different than those of other places.
Can I jump in, Derek?
Yeah, sure, Rana, please go ahead.
Add one thing here. You know, just thinking about the China challenge at the moment, one thing that's really surprised me as I've thought about the tech and trade war and infrastructure. So China has a very top-down system, right? I mean, it is a one-party system. It is a surveillance state. I mean, there's no assumption of privacy amongst individuals. And a lot of people think that in this new world, this new digital world that we're moving into, in which big data is used to create algorithms which will power AI and some of the high growth technologies of the future, a lot of people see that as, oh my gosh, that's a huge advantage. You know, China has all this data. It has, you know, an entire country of data that can be freely mined. And so we need to let big tech companies in this country get bigger and more powerful and mine data. I would actually argue just the opposite. And I find it so amazing and hypocritical when you see the leaders of some of these companies come up in front of Congress and talk about being national champions. Well, they're not national champions. They're giant multinational corporations that would love to be in every market that they can be. And if they can't be in China, that's sad for them. They're going to want to get bigger wherever they can. Being big and top down is not the advantage of the US. If you look at how technological innovation tend to happen in this country over the last 100 years, it happens in two ways. Typically, there is a national funding or push into some kind of basic research or infrastructure. So you had that with the railroads. You had that with the creation of the internet, which was basically, you know, basic tech research through DARPA and the Defense Department. But that technology then seeds a landscape that is then commercialized by many, many players. And the key thing, because innovation tends to happen in young companies, it tends to happen in companies before they go public, because once they go public, they've got the shareholder pressure, and we could do a whole nother hour on shareholder versus stakeholder problems in the markets. But you want to make sure that that landscape is very, very vibrant. And so that's one of the reasons that I was so pleased to see the House Judiciary antitrust report come out a couple of days ago, which I thought was brilliant and really dug down. I mean, 400 pages, but good reading. You know, you will find a lot of what has gone wrong with creating a more vibrant economic ecosystem. We can't let the market be sort of cordoned off and owned by just a few players. Otherwise, the math doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ganesh, I want to go back to you on pick up that point specifically on China, but the also another thing I want to put on the table. Sorry, I keep loading on questions for you to answer, but you talk about, because as Rana said, there's a structure of globalization here, right? That's connected to how our domestic economy has evolved over the last 20 years, and the neoliberal project, say, and it's sort of disentangling some of that. You talk about different categories, policy categories: reverse entanglement, selective disentanglement, and the diversification of economic partners, as we sort of think through how we're going to structure our approach to the global economy in the future. So again, definitely want to hear your thoughts on China and how you're thinking about what a new administration how to approach that challenge, but then also how to address these larger issues of the US engagement with the global economy, given that so many of these challenges are not, I mean, I absolutely agree, this is first order business is to fix things here at home. And I want to get into more about how we should be doing that and some of the specific ideas you offer. But then secondly, the approach to the kind of the structure of the global economy that's part and parcel of the neoliberal project.
So let me try to bring some of that in with also what Rana was talking about with tech. You know, one of the challenges, I think, if you start taking economic power seriously, is that you notice that it's possible for countries to use economic power for geopolitical ends. This is something that China already does effectively. It's something the United States has done for hundreds of years. I mean, any country imposing sanctions on another country is using economic power to try to accomplish some sort of end. One of the challenges that we haven't thought as much about in the context of globalization, though, is how much interdependence means that countries can have leverage over other countries in lots of different ways. Some scholars have called this weaponized interdependence. I call it reverse entanglement, in part because, you know, to go back to what Rana said before, there was a theory that, you know, bringing China into the global economic fold would mean China would become a liberal democracy eventually. And the idea was, we'll entangle them up in all these liberal institutions and they'll become liberal over time. Well, actually, it may be the opposite, that, you know, in so trying to entangle we have all become ensnared into a project where China has increasing leverage over the United States or over countries in Western Europe, over countries all around the world, who are dependent on them for economic goods, services, capital, or other things, depending on where we are and what we're talking about. And so I think one of the questions we need to think about if we want to be resilient as an economy and as a democracy, which is to say we don't want to be subject to pressure from a China or from other countries, is how do we do that? And that's why I think one component, as you mentioned, is what I would call selective disentanglement. I think most of the time people these days call it decoupling, but the idea is, there's some set of things, whether it's supply chains or production, where we should not rely on countries where we have a competitive or adversarial relationship for some set of goods and services. That does not necessarily mean 100% self-sufficiency. There's a huge difference between having a supply chain, if you're the United States, where you're heavily dependent on China versus Canada. Very different for a whole bunch of different reasons. But we need to be thinking about that. And that's not a sense of just comparative advantage without any sense of national security concerns, regime type, or other things. That's very anti-neoliberal, in fact, to take into account these other factors. The second is that we may want to deepen cooperation with close allies who have shared views and values. And so, I think part of diversifying our partners is what that is. It's maybe there's closer relationships to be had between a variety of democracies who see similar challenges from what I think people like to call authoritarian countries. I call nationalist oligarchies, because I think authoritarianism really undervalues in a serious way the economic and social components of what those regimes are up to. But I think we want to deepen those relationships as well. And that's something else that really gives some impetus to what our alliances are for. And I know Derek, you've spent years thinking about this, but for a long time there's been these debates. What's the purpose of NATO? What is the purpose of the Atlantic Alliance? And I think there's a real need for thinking about democracies that have shared values along a whole variety of areas, from political to economic values, social values, actually deepening connections in order to achieve some of these goals and to build resilience together, a kind of collective resilience from these potential outside forms of leverage or threats that could be brought to bear.
Mm-hmm.
And
Ron, I'd like to bring you in and get your
back to tech and just
oh sure, yeah, please, sorry, yes.
The place where I think this is important on the tech question is when you hear a lot of tech CEOs or executives or people who support the tech company, they'll say, well, you have to have the national champion tech companies in order to, and this is an extreme and kind of crazy statement, defeat the Chinese in the AI Cold War. And there's so many problems with that phrase across the board. I won't even get into all the problems with that phrase, but you hear things like that. But the problem is, most of the big tech companies are actually in China, working in China, operating in China. So the idea that they're somehow American working against China really makes no sense. They're global companies that have mixed interests. And I think that's an important part that's undervalued, in addition to Rana's very important point that competition policy is never part of our conversations in foreign policy about competitiveness. And I don't know why that is, because the word competition is right there in both of these, but most of the time people talk about competitiveness with China and they talk about education, immigration, R&D spending, but they never talk about antitrust. They don't talk about anti-monopoly policies, public utility kind of regulations or investment in infrastructure, when in fact, those things have been as much part of our story for competition, innovation, and growth as any of these other areas.
Mm-hmm.
I was taking notes furiously as you were talking, and there's sort of 3 or 4 big picture points that I just want to draw out so that we land on them. Going back to this idea that, we think that if everybody kind of follows our rules, this like rational man, Adam Smith, straight up Adam Smith, I think he gets, wrongly sort of interpreted, but the idea that if we just do what's in our self-interest, that we're somehow going to end up in a good and rational place, that doesn't always happen. I think that the economy, and this is something that happening in the economics profession, it's a debate that is being had in the economics profession itself, is much less predictable than we thought. Our rational interests lead us to much less predictable places than we thought. We're not really operating in the realm of physics here. We're operating more in the realm of biology, of messy systems with strange outcomes. Perfect example, real world example. Look at a company called like Qualcomm. So Qualcomm is, right in the center of the U.S.-China tech trade war. This is a company that, was an American innovator. They basically came up with the chip that enables smartphones to do all the things that they do. They're at the forefront of 5G. They do all the right things that a business should do. They put 20% of their money back into research and development spending, 3% is the S&P average. But they're operating under neoliberal rules in which the idea is go forth and conquer globally. Grab market in the US, but also grab market in China, in Africa, and in Europe, wherever you can. And so that's exactly what the company did over the last several decades. So you get to a situation now where suddenly the political rubber hits the road. We're in a trade war. Qualcomm is supposedly the American 5G champion, but it's doing more than half of its business in China. Meanwhile, it's being sued to lower the price of its patented technology by Apple, a giant American firm. Who thought we were going to end up there? But that's exactly where we are. And these are some of the, I could keep going and going, all the kind of interconnections and the problems that we're going to have as we decouple. In fact, that's what my next book is about, how that process might occur and how messy it will be and what the opportunities, but also the risks are. So that's one thing. There are all kinds of risks when we move in a neoliberal paradigm that can't be seen. Again, supply chains are the perfect example of this. I mean, food security. We are now using the word food security in America. That was not a word that was used any place in the developed world really until COVID. But we have these bizarre food chains where one goes to a grocery store and one goes to a restaurant and they don't talk to each other. And who decided that? It's not particularly efficient. It's not particularly resilient, but it is efficient. And I think that move from efficiency as the end all be all, efficiency measured by speed, measured by share price, measured by simplicity, and to a more resilient system, I think you used that word, Ganesh, in which we're looking at many, many different actors. I'm almost thinking of, just the visual in my mind is always the way that some Chinese architecture, roofs are made of many, many different pieces so that when they move, they don't fall apart, they don't break, they're resilient. And I think that's where we need to get to. And that, to me, begins with thinking about communities. How do we make sure that the next 20 years, 40 years of growth at a global level doesn't leave places at a national level hollowed out in the way that they have been over the last 20?
Well, Ganesh, I'd like to pick up from that comment if you have any thoughts on that, but sort of transitioning to think a little bit about America's role in the world, which we've touched on a little bit. But in your book, there's a quote I'll read back. It said, you write that the foreign policy of the past will not work for the future. We can't step in the same river twice, no matter how comforting that dream might be. So what did you mean by that? And what needs to change the most in terms of America's approach to the world?
Well, I think one of the points I make in the book, which is really a theme, is that this is a moment of great change, not a kind of time when you can when not an exception, that everything will go back to normal as if there was some normal before that we can go back to. That we have to be moving forward all the time, and that this moment in particular. And I think we see it very acutely now. Even people who maybe didn't want to see, President Trump, for example, and some of the changes he's tried to make as creating a kind of moment that is a big change for neoliberalism and that era in American and world history. Between COVID, between that in the United States, between the fires in the West and the murder of George Floyd and the protests since this summer. I think pretty much everyone understands that this is actually quite a big moment, that a lot of history is happening in a short period of time right now. And those moments happen throughout history. And they're moments where you can't think that we're just going to go back to what was. You actually have to build something new. And one of the things I find so striking in foreign policy is, there's a, there's the famous autobiography, Present at the Creation. And the striking thing about that title is that the people there thought they were at the creation. I mean, there's not very much humility in that kind of sense, but they were saying, we actually built the world, we created it. And that sense of empowerment that you can actually create and build, not that you have to accept what is given as the only thing that exists, or that what you're trying to recover, but that you're trying to create, I think is part of what I was getting at with that line, which is, this is one of those moments where lots of things are going to change and you have to decide what kind of world you want to build and then try to build it. And that's not the same as just accepting what was or trying to go backwards, which you can't, the way time works, you can't do that, as far as I understand. But so that's what I mean. I think we have to move forward and can't think that, in some way we're just going to go back a few years and everything will be okay. It's going to require new thinking, different paradigms. And this is one of those generative moments where a lot will be worked out. And then we might go back to a period of more ordinary politics for, some number of decades until there's another really big crisis where the world will have to be rethought anew.
Sure.
Can I just jump in and say one thing? I also think it's important to say, this isn't all up to the US. We often have these conversations in which we talk about what, our policymakers should do. The rest of the world is moving on, and particularly in economics and markets, there are shifts happening in the next 2 to 5 years that are going to limit our ability to do things. The power of the dollar, for example, as a reserve currency, I think is going to be severely under threat in the next 5 years. That could change if we had some really smart policy making. We might have 15 years, but I would say within the next 5 to 15 years, there's no question to me that we're moving to a post-dollar world, a world in which there's going to be multiple currencies, the power of the dollar to allow the US to do some of the things that it's been able to do, to have the kind of debt levels and trade imbalances, that's going to go away. So really the moment is now to rethink how we want to have a more balanced economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to hear from both of you on specific ideas. And I'm just struck, the post-dollar world made me think back, it was 12 years ago. I think Fareed Zakaria had a best-selling book called The Post-American World. So these trends have been underway for quite some time. And I would argue that President Obama, the Obama administration saw these trends, and the kind of the narrative coming in for President Obama was this world had been changing since the new millennium. The U.S. had spent the better part of a decade preoccupied in 2 wars that actually were not really addressing these sort of structural trends that were underway. And that's why we needed to pivot out of that situation in Iraq and Afghanistan and try to position ourselves to be able to lead in the future without any presumption that it was just going to be easy or that there was something that was ordained by the Almighty that we should lead, but that the U.S. was actually, if it had the right kind of leadership and the right kind of policy decisions, was uniquely positioned to succeed in this new world. Of course, we've taken a lot of big steps back in the last 3 years, but nevertheless, Ganesh, I was struck in reading your book when you wrote it, and so it was published late last year, early this year. I think you said at some point, like we haven't had a systemic crisis of the kind that, is, the kind of scronic argument where politics is shifting dramatically. Well, obviously now we're in that, and sort of a lot of things that seemed even a stretch a year ago now seem, I think, possible, at least in terms of big change. So let's start with America and the world, but also obviously here at home, some of those big changes you're looking for, conceding that we can't go back to the past. We don't want to throw away everything about the past. There was some good stuff in the past that we might we've perhaps forgotten or overlooked, or have muscles we've underutilized in the last few years that we need to strengthen up again. But both kind of what should we recover from our past, but also what are the new things, the big creative ideas, the present at the creation kind of ideas we should be pursuing both in foreign policy, but also here at home. First, Ganesh, and then I'll turn to you, Ron.
Yeah, so I think there's just so much, and there's so many across.
Where to start? Right?
Yeah, at the point that where we started, if you define the crisis as political, economic, and social. There's lots of things that we can talk about domestically and internationally. I'll just pick up a couple illustrations and things that we've also talked a little bit about. One on the domestic economic front, but that also I think has really important international and comparative components, is antitrust, competition policy, and tech especially, but antitrust and competition policy overall. And it's actually almost a perfect mapping. It's why it's such an interesting topic. In the United States, we had an antitrust policy and an anti-monopoly philosophy for about a century, starting in the late 19th century through the 1970s, that was very, very worried about concentrations of power, not just because of consumer prices or efficiency, but because they would have effects on society, on politics, on everything else, on the well-being of people, because they saw that power concentrated anywhere, including in the private sector, was a danger to freedom. The fundamental premise of our antitrust and anti-monopoly laws is that power is a danger to freedom. And I think what's striking is then, starting in the 1970s, you have this entirely new theory of antitrust that Robert Bork, who some of you were watching may have heard of. He was nominated to be a judge in the 1980s and blocked from the Supreme Court, and it's become a verb called borking, to block someone from the court. So Robert Bork had this idea that antitrust should just be about efficiency and focused on consumer prices. And what that actually meant was, in some cases, monopolies might be good. And we want to concentrate more. So it's the exact opposite of 100 years and the entire purpose of these laws. And we've really lived in that era, so that sector after sector, there's more and more concentration. And I think one thing we've seen in the last couple of years is a really swift motion towards rejecting that old approach and moving more towards recovering. So this, in a way, is going back to the old, but trying to do it in a new way. The old understanding of what antitrust and anti-monopoly competition policy is for. And I think you see that in the big tech hearings and in the report that Rana mentioned earlier as one place. But it's really an economy-wide problem that, whether you're looking in agriculture or rental cars, pretty much in any market, there's massive concentration. And so thinking differently about antitrust, and I raise this because, it's an issue that in Europe, there's a whole set of views on competition policy, particularly on tech, that are different than what the United States is doing, different than what's happening in China. But I think these are conversations that part of the kind of, if there's a new president at the creation now, thinking about concentration of power, monopoly, antitrust is going to be a big part of that story. And whether there will be one or many approaches, even among liberal democracies, is a really important question that we don't know the answer to yet, but we're going to have to see in the next, I think 5 to 10 years. And you have a big difference in what's happening in India versus the EU versus the United States, even all three democracies. So that's one place where I think there's a big space for action. I'll flag just one other to try to be a little bit more internationalist in how we might think of another area. And that's thinking about supply chains and trade, exports, and the whole network of the transmission of goods across borders. In the United States, and I think to a lesser extent in Western Europe, but to some extent still, the idea of industrial policy has just been a bad word. I think of it as like the Lord Voldemort of economics. Like, you must not name it because it is so scary and so dangerous and so evil. But in fact, every country has an industrial policy. When you're giving tax breaks to certain sectors like oil, that is an industrial policy. It is a choice to benefit one sector over others and to try to shape its moving forward. And I think one thing that we'll think about more and more, especially with COVID, is how do we think about supply chains? How do we think about industrial policy? And I think one of the key things in the new world as we look forward is thinking about how we can collaborate across allies to, as I mentioned, have a kind of collective resilience and collective investment in technology, in the supply chains, in the kind of infrastructure and manufacturing that we might want to have, but that allows for some of the benefits of trade, but that doesn't see it either in the form of kind of neoliberal globalization where there's no rules, no values, and no sense of kind of national security, political or community or other interests as part of the story, but actually refashions that to think in terms of climate change and energy as a core component of what we want to achieve, not just letting the market passively do whatever it chooses to do. But that's a place where we might focus, where we might think, and where we might think together across boundaries about how we're going to achieve some of those goals. And that's a very different approach, I think, than either saying, how do we just, regulate greenhouse gas emissions, including globally, the kind of JCPOA model. It's also a very different approach than the market approach, which is let's just let markets do what they do and capital will allocate however it wants to. It's an approach that says we should accomplish some goal that we decide to set together about clean energy, about getting to zero net emissions, and that we can build policies to achieve that goal. I think there's great opportunity there too. And I think that's very different than things that we've seen in the past.
Sure. Rana, before I get to you, let me just press Ganesh on one point, which is the structure of global governance. If you think back to UN Security Council, IMF, World Bank, NATO, very much products of the president at the creation era. Obama administration tries to reform the UN Security Council, didn't get anywhere. Tried to elevate the G20, de-emphasize then the G8, now the G7. Making the argument the G20 is a better reflection of the realities of the 21st century. That was complicated, didn't really get anywhere. Although we still have a G20, but it never realized the aspiration. You talk a little bit in the book about this idea of an alliance of democracies or some grouping of democracies. Just real quickly, and then Rana, I want to turn to you for your thoughts on all of this. Your specific ideas of what we should do to reform global governance to make it more reflective of the challenges of the future.
Yeah, so just on the last point, I in the book note that, there was this old idea from maybe 15 years ago about an alliance of democracies that was pretty neoconservative or liberal internationalist. It was going to be countries that would come together and do a lot of democracy promotion, sometimes by force in other places. I think that idea makes very little sense. I didn't think it made much sense then. I don't think it makes much sense now. But you could think of it actually in a very different way, that an alliance of democracies that exists to defend democracy, to shore it up, to make it more resilient, whether that's from election interference or economically, socially, that might have great promise because it allows us collectively to kind of have a countervailing power against the pretty powerful countries outside of that, particularly China, but others as well. And I think there's promise there for that. I think, more broadly, one of the things I think that's striking about institutional innovations and change is that a lot of things often get tried or proposed in moments where it's not ripe for change. But then the big crisis happens and a lot of change is possible, and it sort of unlocks changes that everyone thought were not possible because they had failed in the past. I think, and even if you go back, a simple thing like the United States not joining the League of Nations, but then joining and leading into the UN, what a difference 20 years makes in thinking about that and in how people's views shift. And obviously the Depression and the war are a major part of that story, but nonetheless, so I think of this moment as potentially being one that unlocks a wide variety of abilities to do institutional change at the global level. I think one of the big challenges with that is that any bureaucracy, including global ones, have their own logics to them and their own inertia to them that will, make change harder. So it requires a lot more effort once these things have been built. But that doesn't mean that it's not doable. And I think if people want to use the capital, it'll happen. If not, I think what we'll see is what Rana hinted at earlier with the post-dollar world comment, which is the kind of bubbling up rather than organized creation of new and different types of institutions. And whether that is kind of working around US sanctions regimes, for example, and the SWIFT banking system to try to come up with other modes for payments, whether that's a kind of modified barter kind of system like Instax or other things, you might see these kind of other kinds of systems emergent because there isn't leadership that's actually trying to build a new system. So I think this is an opportunity for leadership to actually do that and to try to take the lead and reshape some of the systems. I think if we fail to do that, the system will be refashioned. It will just happen in ways that are less organized and are less coordinated, and that may be less effective at actually accomplishing some of our individual goals and some of our shared goals.
Rana?
Yeah, let me just make one more point on currency before I jump into my solutions. I agree that there are kind of makeshift solutions bubbling up. I mean, Bitcoin is a perfect example. There are all kinds of, because of the way in which technology can allow now currency markets to be very grassroots, that will happen. But what I'm talking about with the post-dollar world is actually something more profound, which is that I think we're pretty much already in a tripolar world in which the US, Europe, and China are kind of creating different geopolitical blocks. The Chinese explicitly want to have the digital RMB as a currency for trade, as a global reserve currency. The euro, if Europe can really kind of hang together through this COVID crisis, the euro may become an alternative reserve currency. And so the power of the dollar is ebbing. Now, currencies are at core about trust in a nation. We squandered a lot of that trust in the last 4 years. And so we are going to have to do some work to get it back. And I think that one of the ways that we could do that work and talk about new alliances that might be made, if we had, say, a Biden administration, one of the very first things that I would put on the to-do list is to go to our allies in Europe, apologize for our behavior over the last 4 years, and then say, we would like to work with you on crafting a new digital framework for trade in the era of the digital economy. I mean, we are in the process of warp speeding to a transition from a tangible economy based on kind of widgets and services, things you can see and feel, to a digital economy. That is going to create certain natural monopoly effects that could actually exacerbate some of the problems that Ganesh has been talking about around concentration of power. In this new economy, it's all about data. Data is the new oil. It is mined from us. Companies of all kinds, not just the big 5 tech companies, but any kind of consumer product company, a luxury goods brand, a car company. All these companies are mining data. That is the oil of the new economy. And so we need to set, I think, as liberal democracies, some rules around this. I mean, some people like Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote In the Age of Surveillance Capitalism, would say, look, this is a real travesty. We should just cut this off. I personally think we are past the point of being able to say there will be no data mining, period. But different countries in Europe are thinking about this in different ways. They're thinking about public data banks that might allow large and small companies and individuals and the state to have access to this national resource. The state of California is thinking about giving a digital dividend that companies would have to pay, almost like a tax. If you're going to mine data, well, just the same as if you're going to mine oil or minerals in Alaska or Wyoming, the people that live in that state are going to have to get some of that wealth given back to them. These things are all up for grabs, but what I think we should do, the US and Europe in particular, and other liberal democracies, maybe Japan, maybe Korea, some around the world, should come together and put a framework. What are our values around this new economy? What can and can't be done? How should data be treated? That would be a good way to start to re-strengthen, reorganize some of the trade alliances that have been so broken in the last 20 years. It would also set, it would be not about fighting with China, which is exporting its own surveillance capitalism to any number of countries, but it would be about just setting a different model. Look, if you want to join our group, here we are. If you want to join the Chinese group, there it is. Let's present some alternatives instead of just criticizing.
Mm-hmm. Well, we've only got about 5 minutes left, and what I'd like to do is end on how we get this done. Ganesh, at the end of your book, you offer some kind of axioms, I guess, of what we should be looking for in the future to try to implement some of this. And you've been in the trenches earlier this year on the campaign trail, trying to talk about how we translate these very important ideas into policies. I think the first of your suggestions is we've got to get ready to play hardball. And that's been a theme of the campaign. It came up last night a bit in the debate, the discussion of what to do about the size of the Supreme Court in the future. And I'm just curious from both of you, what does that hardball look like? If we're gonna, understanding that we are in a new moment and perhaps there's a greater appetite and willingness to think creatively and to break through some of these bureaucratic structures and vested interests in trying to bring about fundamental change. But I think there's also an acknowledgement that there's going to be fierce resistance to this. And I think no matter the outcome of the election, even if it is a Biden administration, the Trumpism will live on. And in many ways, what little guardrails it's got now it will have zero guardrails outside of government. So how do we do this? Because I think you make a very compelling case for the why and the what. I'm curious about the how.
So let me just start with the hardball point in the American context and focused on politics and offer a different version of a different vision for what you said about where the future of Trumpism might even go if we did play hardball. So if part of the problem that we have in our system across the board is that it is largely unresponsive to what people want. And in fact, large majorities of people want to expand Social Security, want to raise taxes on the extremely wealthy. I mean, a wealth tax is extraordinarily popular among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It's only not popular among elites who are friends with really wealthy people. Everyone else likes it. It's a striking thing how much consensus there actually is. Most Americans think the government is corrupt. The only people who don't are people who live in Washington who work with all the people in government and don't want to see themselves as corrupt. Everyone else thinks that they're doing the bidding of corporations and they're not actually serving the general public's interest.
I personally try not to be corrupt. That's my own.
I
live here in Washington.
Present company, of course, excluded.
Sure.
But part of what that means is that really taking a structural reform seriously in terms of politics is a core important component. I mean, and I think one starting point for this is a bill that's called HR 1, but it's a variety of democracy-based reforms, including voting rights reforms, gerrymandering reforms, campaign finance reforms, lobbying reforms, ethics rules. And I think it goes pretty far and is a good bill. Could it go farther? Absolutely. There could be much more stringent restrictions on lobbying, on ethics issues, for example, that are consistent with our constitutional rules. But moving in that direction, passing something like that, when people talk about those kinds of changes, that kind of thing is not just good policy because it's good for democracy to have voting be something that everyone can do without massive voter suppression. It also is something that means that the political landscape will change in terms of Congress and who has voice and what kinds of things can be passed. When you rebalance the power between lobbyists and ordinary citizens, it means that the lobbyists will have less influence. You'll have different kinds of laws passed on economic policy, on a wide variety of other things. So I think when I talk about playing hardball, I think part of it is being willing to use power to actually push through things that are good policy, but are also power building. Mm-hmm. And you can use power in a way that saps all of your political capital. You can also use power in a way that unlocks the possibility of accomplishing more things in the future. And that's something that, I think democracy reforms do, because you could imagine a system where you do a variety of democracy reforms. You choose not to do anything about the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court strikes down all of them. That's not an effective strategy. That is still the end of democracy if the Supreme Court strikes down all the reforms and upholds all the voter suppression laws across the country. Reforming the Supreme Court will be essential actually to maintaining democracy. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something people haven't fully appreciated, is the legitimacy of the court and the legitimacy of our constitutional system are tied up in these democracy problems that we face acutely right now. So making those bigger changes is going to be necessary, but a more democratic system will actually allow us to do more. And I think if government starts delivering for people in a way that they can feel it, and you see this with even Obamacare, which when passed, not popular, but when people get the benefits and see what they do, becomes extremely popular. If government starts delivering for people, it will become more popular, and it also makes conspiracy theories and all of the anti-government kind of rhetoric and actions less popular, and will turn those, I think, over time into a kind of fringier thing. So, when I talk about these eras in the book, and I'll just end with this, the striking thing about eras and moments of big change is that they don't lead to tit for tat retaliation forever. There's a big sea change. One side wins, the other side loses, and there's a new equilibrium that's created that persists for about a generation. And then there's another big crisis, another big sea change, and then a new equilibrium. Mm-hmm. And so to me, the question is, what is the new equilibrium going to look like going forward? And I do think we're in one of these, convulsive moments where a lot's going to change. I think it could be a new democratic equilibrium. It could be a great democracy, but we would have to govern in a way to achieve that. And part of that means being willing to actually use power to take on some hard fights, but to do that smartly and in ways that actually make our country more democratic and create the kind of structures that will lead to more democracy happening, just how the structures operate, that will lead to more equality because you've restructured those core things. And that's where you want to use your capital, is creating the kind of change that means the machine just works correctly going forward, to satisfy the values that we want to accomplish.
Terrific. Ron, I want to give you the last word.
Okay, very quickly, I'll just say I very much agree with the pendulum shift analogy. That absolutely happens in economics as well. I would argue that we've been, from the 30s to 70s, we were kind of in a period of wealth distribution, post-New Deal. From the 80s till really now, it should have been the financial crisis, but let's say now we were in a period of wealth creation and growing inequality. I think we're moving back to wealth distribution and a more equally shared pie, a shifting of power from the private sector to somewhat to the public sector. I think a shift from capital to labor. And I think that some of these things, I love everything Ganesh said about hardball and changing money politics and the court, et cetera. But I think some of this is happening naturally too. We are already, in terms of new workers coming into the labor force, we're already majority minority. Millennials are going to be the biggest voting bloc soon, if not, in this election, working bloc already. That's going to just necessitate certain changes. I think we will see some debt jubilees. I think that we will see some shifting of entitlements. I think that I love Ganesh's idea about a national service program. I mean, I'm not a big proponent of UBI. I think we need to value the dignity of work. And there are so many things out there to put people to work doing right now. It's just a no-brainer. We just need a little more coherent leadership. So I'll stop there.
Well, I'm glad we ended on an optimistic note, and I want to thank you both. Thank you, Rana, for being part of this discussion, and especially thanks to Ganesh for being part of this discussion, hanging with us in terms of scheduling this event, but also writing this terrific new book, The Great Democracy. I really appreciate both of your times and for all your interesting ideas. Wow, I could have talked with you all morning, but I got to get back to my learning pod. So thank you very much for taking the time. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. For those of you who missed part of this, we'll be putting it on YouTube a little later today. I want everyone to be safe and take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.